All right. Hello and welcome to OnSurviving. My name is Megan and I'm a survivor.
And my name is Nobly, and I am a survivor.
Together, we're bringing OnSurviving to the world because it matters.
It matters to me because alongside the potent fears of our frail hearts is so much hurt, loss, and trust issues that I often had to navigate through all by myself with very little resources and zero trust. I am passionate about doing this project because I get to tell my story and be that trusting person to be there and help with resources that I never had and hopefully make a difference of people's process of surviving.
It matters to me because I want others to recognize the deep strength and rich humanity involved in every step of the process of surviving the tragedies life brings many of us. I suffered silently and alone for too long, and I want to help others to find hope more quickly and readily and feel and be less alone in the process of surviving.
On surviving matters, you matter, we matter.
All right. Very exciting to get started here. Noba Lee, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're planning on doing here today?
Yes, I'm super excited. In today's episode, we are going to be talking with Meg Martin, who's a provider for the houseless and also the director of Interfaith Works shelter in Olympia, Washington. And she is a person that took part in my personal story of going from not being housed to housed. And she is an all around amazing human.
Awesome.
So I'm super excited to welcome Meg.
Awesome. So yeah, so glad you're here. Hey, before we dive into things, I do like to tell folks that we are here to speak really honestly and openly, and we really encourage you to do that too, Meg. And then for anybody who is watching or listening here with us live or in a recording in the near future, that if anything's touches close to home, start to trigger some any kind of trauma history you may have. We just really want to encourage you to take care of yourself. Um, Turn it off, come back later if you want, reach out for support. And if you're feeling like you're just not comfortable reaching out to somebody in your close circle of friends or family, encourage you to call or text 988 crisis line you can get from anywhere at any time in the country. They're there to help and really encourage you to do so. So, with
So, Meg, would you like to start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been doing this work and kind of what made you want to get into this line of work?
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Um, I I know we're gonna get into all of this, but it feels really special to be here with both of you today. And I also am a survivor and just like wrapping my head around how much everybody's been through on this call and other people who are watching and just like it's really inspiring and beautiful. So I'm really happy to be here. Um, Yeah, so I'm the executive director for Interfaith Works in Thurston County in Olympia. And I've been with Interfaith Works 10 years. But before that, which kind of got me into work, I had been involved in a street outreach project here in Olympia, a beloved volunteer based street outreach project called Eggy Hop, and had been doing mobile syringe exchange and homeless outreach for many years before working officially for Interfaith Works. Um, Before that, I was drawn towards social work, some kind of, I didn't really know what it was going to look like or what it was going to do, but basically because of my own struggles with mental health and addiction and people in my family who I was extremely close with, who were living in the jail streets, rehab kind of cycle. I just really fundamentally thought to myself, like, there has to be a better way. There has to be more for people. And if there's not, then we need to build it. And that's what kind of fundamentally has brought me to this place that we're at now. We got involved with Interfaith Works directly in 2012 um, because the city was passing a series of quality of life ordinances, which was essentially just restricting the use of public space, sleeping bans, camping bans, things like that. And at that time, our shelter system was only operating at 50% occupancy. So that meant there were beds open every night. But meanwhile, there were all these really vulnerable people, many of them elders, disabled folks who weren't getting into the shelter. And I would see them on my street outreach shifts week after week, year after year. So I started asking, why don't you go to shelter? Like there at that time there were a couple main shelters in town. And we started hearing all the reasons why. And pets weren't allowed. Couples were separated. They were being breathalyzed. There were really rigid curfews and times that people could or couldn't come in. It was very gendered. Men go here, women go here. So for anybody that didn't fit those categories, it was a very threatening environment. People experienced a lot of racism and a lot of sexism. And so just by listening and learning, we started to, myself and two other street outreach workers, Jeff and Cassie, we started to advocate to open a shelter that just let people be exactly as they are. Come in the door first, and then let's worry about case management. Come in the door first, and then let's worry about treatment. And that was a very radical thought at that time, and very threatening to many people. And so, even in a progressive community like Olympia, it was very difficult for us to get our doors open. So, we had to partner with a more established entity that was more sort of safe and trustworthy. And so, that's when we came under the umbrella of Interfaith Works. So, that was in 2012. And then a lot happened, but eventually we were able to open the shelter in 2014. So today we've grown significantly, but yeah, just my own story and the story of those in my family that have gone through this and everybody that I met on the street has always been the motivator.
You know, I wrote down when you said you thought there has to be a better way. And I have thought those exact same words so many times. And I just wonder how many of us struggling through our own survival stories have thought those exact same words.
Yeah.
Nobly, does that ever come up for you?
Oh yeah, quite a bit. A lot now being in the work that I'm in as well, because just, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and interestingly, like all three of us did choose to do something um in addition to whatever we do in our private lives and our own time, but to do work professionally to try to make some changes and make a difference. And pretty incredible that you were looking to start a shelter um, not part of an already existing organization initially, Meg. That so, and how many people were you were saying we? Was
Mhm.
there? What was your group that you were working with in working to start this shelter?
Yeah, well, it was just me and Jeff and Cassie, and they're just two of my best friends, and we had done Eggy Hop together for a really long time. So Eggy Hop is the street outreach, it's mobile syringe exchange, And at the time, not anymore, but at the time it was on bicycles. So you would literally like load up a bike cart full of blankets, hand warmers, gloves. We got day old pizza donations from Vic's and day old pastry donations from coffee shops. And we had hot coffee, cold
Yeah.
pizza, and whatever donated supplies that we had. And so it was the three of us, but it was really the three of us as like conduits to what everyone on the street, especially people who were active drug users, who were in chaotically violent interpersonal relationships, people who didn't fit the like, perfect. There's like this weird societal ideal of a homeless person that's like the person who's just like hard on their luck and they're going to get a job and they're going to become contributing members of society and they just need, and it's like anyone who doesn't fit that is immediately like stigmatized so hard and it's their fault and they don't want the help. They are treatment resistant. They're hardest to serve. They're chronically homeless. It's just like all this terminology that immediately flips it to the fault of the person.
Yep.
And so that was we were really kind of the conduit, I feel like, for their voices to be elevated. Probably helped that we were like three young white kids that were at least somewhat college educated and knew how to navigate a city council meeting a little bit, not at first, but we figured it out. So that was really it. But Interfaith Works, they were also advocating because at first we weren't advocating for us to open it. We were like, city, if you're passing these laws to restrict where people can go, we believe that you need to provide a place for them to go. And then the city quickly was like, no, that's not our job. We don't do that. So then it kind of started to morph into like, well, then who's going to do it? And so Interfaith Works was very early and they said, we want to help. We want to make this something that you all could be able to do. And I didn't trust it at first because I was like, we don't need another faith-based shelter. We need something different. And it took me a minute to realize that interfaith was really different.
Couple of things popping up for me. I'm just going to stick with the one that's top of mind now. Saying you don't need another faith-based shelter. Like, what was it that you were worried might? What was it that you didn't trust, or you were worried that would be done in a way that I'm assuming wasn't going to serve people you were really trying to serve?
Well, I was worried that if we went under the umbrella of like a nonprofit organization, that they would say we have to background check people and we wouldn't be able to let people in it'd be too much of a liability to let someone in with a violent record or with a drug record, or that they would somehow, if we were a program of Interfaith Works, they would somehow put, like restrictions in place, like we'd have to require sobriety or we'd have to do this, that, or another. And so, because the laws don't dictate any of that, it's like, it's all organizational policy for the most part. There are some laws that dictate barriers to, because all of those things I talk about, those are referred to as like barriers to service, barriers to housing. And we were trying to open a place that didn't have as many of those as possible. One that the city did hold on to at first, that they ended up making it legally binding because they tied it to our permit to operate, was that we had to screen out sex offenders level 2 and 3. which I don't actually agree with doing. We could talk about that if we want to or not. I believe it makes communities less safe. But we don't have that restriction anymore, which is really cool because the city saw that, all the fears that people had that if we just let people in the door without background checks, without IDs, without sobriety requirements, that all hell was going to break loose and the whole city was going to burn down. You know, it's like, oh, that didn't happen. And so now, 10 years later, every shelter is low barrier. Like the bar has just been completely changed.
In Olympia specifically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
That's pretty awesome. All of the shelters in Olympia are low barrier?
Yep.
I didn't realize that. That's
Even Salvation Army.
wow. When did
I
that
mean, it's
change?
still, I still have my, there are still things that are barriers, but like compared to what we were dealing with before, yes, absolutely, all of them. Nobody, Drexel breathalyzed people. They don't do that anymore. There used to be criminal background checks for everybody. So it's dramatically changed.
Wow.
Salvation Army has gender inclusive dorms now where trans people can choose what dorm to sleep in. It's still men and women, but I'm like, there's been so much progress. And I
Wonderful.
think a lot of it was because there was like this example set.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it was Interfaith Works that got our back to do all that, but which is amazing. But it was my fear that there would be some kind of pushback to it, but there has never been. And in fact, the network of Interfaith Works folks are some of the most like inspiring progressive people, and they're all just like living their life. They're not like, young radical activists like we were, they're just like church people that are just like have families and they're, and they've been kind of behind the scenes moving things along for so long that by the time the fiery activists showed up, we had this whole amazing foundation and like giant, like the shoulders of giants to stand on.
Wow, that's extraordinary.
Yeah.
um, is one of the barriers that still exists the sex offender barrier?
Not at our shelter. It does still exist in other programs around town, but it was lifted from our permit. So we still do screen everybody on the sex offender registry. Like we'll still run everyone's name. And if there were to be something that was like, like the fundamental thought is that we would rather give someone an opportunity and then base any kind of decisions about whether they continue staying with us or not based on their ability to be safe in our space rather than based on what their record says about them. Um, that said, we reserve the right to run people's records if we need to, if it's posing any kind of threat of safety to the group. If there was somebody that had, multiple sex offenses against like disabled elderly people, for example, that would be like something we would really need to talk with them about before we gave them a bed. So we still run it to get the information, but we don't necessarily use it to keep people out before giving them an opportunity to show that they can be safe in the space.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really similar approach to a guest we had on a while ago, but not in a traditional shelter, in a safe outdoor space. Um, and I know that they struggled with that. And I know that one of the things that I would hear a lot in working with communities on what they were going to do regarding homelessness in the community, there was always this, who deserves help and who doesn't, and not seeming to understand that helping people is going to make everybody safer. So I am actually curious if you would want to talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah, I mean, the sad reality is that somewhere in the ballpark of over 95% of, a lot of times when people are talking about sex offenders, what they're kind of saying between the lines is like childhood sex offenders, like people who are harming children. Or even if they're not, they're talking about people who are harming adults. Like, but the thing is that over 95% of assaults that happen, sexual assaults and sexual abuse that occurs from a direct an immediate family member, an extended family member, or a close friend of a family or friend of the individual. And so, but we have created this stranger danger narrative that the people who we need to be afraid about are lurking in the shadows. They're in the, that they're going to jump you on your way home. They're going to like this, that, or another thing. And that's really, the rarity. Those things do occur, of course. That type of random kind of chaotic violence does occur, but it's really the tiniest percentage of it happening. And um so there's that element of it, is that like somebody showing up at a shelter who has done something like that isn't necessarily, that doesn't mean they're going to like be very likely at all to reoffend when they show up to a shelter full of strangers that they don't know or don't have any kind of connection to. The other piece of it is that when people, whether it's a sex offense or any other type of reentry from criminal offenses, when people have their basic needs met, have access to the resources that we all need to survive and thrive, they are significantly more likely to comply with their treatment and to be successful in complying with their treatment. When they are isolated from housing, isolated from community, isolated from social interactions that are healthy and safe, they are far more likely to reoffend. Sometimes that's so that they can go back to jail for a dry place to be. But other times that's because what they're going through maybe does have significant like connections to mental health and to substance use, and they really do need to comply or go through some type of therapeutic treatment. And they're not going to be able to do that if they don't have access to resources and having their basic needs met. So, I mean, the other part about it too is that particularly with sex offenders, they already are living in our communities. I mean, that's the kind of the thing that is interesting whenever we try to open a new location and people are like, well, what about the sex offenders? I always do a sex offender search in your area, in the area of where we're trying to go, and they already are all living in the neighborhood. So it's like, but to grasp why it's not a threat means that you have to admit the truth, which is that the most dangerous place is like at Thanksgiving dinner. Like that's where we need to be most worried about childhood sexual abuse. And it's like nobody wants to look at that, right? And so instead it's that homeless guy over there that's going to snatch my child and do something terrible to them. Um yeah. So that's why we believe that people shouldn't be screened out because of their backgrounds.
Uh, thank you. Thank you for that. It hit all the marks in my mind. you know, when I, as a sexual abuse survivor myself, um, uh, I will say that, first of all, of the 3 times that it happened, not one was held accountable and sits on the registry. So we don't even know.
Right.
Um, all were people who I should have been able to trust, right? From, you know, a trusted adult as a child, to a gaggle of preppy kids at my
Yeah.
high school, to a young man I was dating.
Yeah.
And so none of those fit the profile that everybody is that stranger danger profile that everybody seems worried about. But I think like the more we isolate people for all sorts of reasons, the worse off we are, right? I know, like, I mean, it's part of why we do this. We think about like our survival stories, and we, Nobly and I've both talked about the, like kind of the monster in us that will rear up when we're like in trauma response, right? Like it's, and people have, I myself experienced people draw away, and if I I came down to only a few people for a time that, really wanted to be around me. And the more and more isolated, I knew the worse off I was getting. And that's just in my world. And so I can only imagine um, how that is when somebody has committed a sex offense before and completely isolated and not getting the help. So yeah, as a survivor myself, I would much rather see people getting housed and getting help. And um, yeah, let's make this world better. That's just, yeah.
Well, and this I know. I personally stayed at Interfaith Work Shelter from January of 2015 to July of 2016, and did not know the backstory of the other guests that were there. Didn't know if there were sex offenders there at the time or not. But what I do know is whatever group of people were in the shelter for the night took care of each other. Like I've never felt more safe than the people that were sleeping in beds in the same place as me and on the streets. I have to mention my dear late friend Nature, because I would go, I would be by myself, single on the street, and no matter what, like he protected me. I had a safe spot next to him no matter where he was laying. And so it didn't matter to me who was there and what they had done, because I know that people are rehabilitated. If you look at me right now on paper, a lot of people would go, woof, this chick is, all these things that I'm not.
Yeah.
And so as far as people assuming, because Meg touched on this earlier, assuming that we choose to be on the streets because we're drug addicts and we're lazy and we just want to mooch off of whoever, and that because if you urinate in Sylvester Park, you're a sex offender. And so it's like we don't know what that looks like for people. So I felt so safe, and I didn't care about who was there and what they had done. I just cared that we all got to be there together and that we all really cared about each other's well-being. And not to mention the volunteers and staff. They were forever just walking around and checking on everybody, and total safe environment. So I'm so glad to hear that more places are not putting stipulations on each individual human,
Yeah.
and that is amazing to me.
Probably was Interfaith the only shelter that you were able to get into at that time around 2015? Or
I
was it?
very so I'm sorry. I very seldomly got into Salvation Army because at the time, like I wasn't clean, or I wasn't sober, or I for whatever reason, I often didn't get the bed. And then a lot of times it was who was in a higher need. And I was young and I was, I didn't, of course, I would much rather want a disabled senior citizen to have it before I had it. So a lot of times I just kind of fell through the crack, and a lot of times back then there was a lottery. You just showed
Yeah.
up and you got a number, and if your number's called, you're getting to bed that night. And if your number's not, you're not. And that was heartbreaking, not only for the staff calling the numbers, but for, the people not being called on their number.
Yeah, so back then we had 30 because we were only allowed to open with 30 beds. So we had 30 beds, and then what we would do when people weren't going to stay in their bed, we would say, if you're going to be out for the night, do we have permission to have somebody else sleep in your bed? Which is so funny now to think about doing that. Everything's just so different. But so every night there would be like somewhere between 1 and 9, sometimes even beds, or if somebody was like, um in treatment or something, we would keep their bed for them, but then we would have other people stay in it while they weren't there. And if we had permission to do that, which most everybody, like what Nobly's saying, would say, yes, have somebody else stay in my bed if I'm not going to use it. And so then for the beds that we did have available every night, we did a lottery, and we ended up waiting it for people who were disabled, and people who were at higher risk of violence on the street. But Nobly was notorious for getting in the lottery and then giving it to somebody who she thought needed it more. And we'd always be like, no, you really need it. Like, you really, really need it. Like, don't do that. And she'd be like, no, I'm good. Like, so then once you had your bed assigned, it was your bed as long as you needed it. So Nobly, I can't remember exactly, but I think you went through a couple rounds of getting an assigned bed.
Yeah, I did. And then when I got beaten so badly, I had a permanent, bed, but I often, camped. And
Yeah.
so I try to be decent about letting you guys know so that my bed could be taken. I
Yeah.
mean, given to somebody else. So yeah.
That was a wild day that day.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thanks for writing about that nobly too. I hope people read that if they haven't had a chance to. And I'm curious. I mean, 2015 doesn't seem like that long ago, and yet in the kind of arena when we're thinking about houselessness, it feels like ages ago. I mean, it feels like things are so different. I mean, we had a number of questions in here, Meg, around kind of what was it like then, what's it like now,
Yeah.
change, and I think we've been touching on a lot of that. So I'm curious, if both of you have, if you can think about like how you would describe what it was like then, and what was different about it then as compared to now. Nobly, I'm kind of moving into one of your questions.
Well, for me, at the time, we, I think we got to go there at 5 p.m. and then, we would have dinner and we could go back and forth. There was a curfew, and then we'd leave, I think at 6 or 7 in the morning, and be gone throughout the day. Now, for me, it wasn't that hard in the beginning to be able to be in the establishments because I looked the part. You know what I mean? I would relatively dress good and, whatever. But so I could hang out at certain places and we could, I love to go to the Purple House. It was a place where you could do your laundry, you could take a shower, you could cook food, you could charge up, you could just hang out. So there were some places that, that we could go and be safe. But I've seen many of times of the people that didn't, look the part, that were, just judged and thrown out of places. And so it was kind of hard to, maybe not so much for me, but for my street family, to have places to be, during the day that were safe and dry places. We did have a couple of good, I call them chow halls, but Salvation Army and, a couple other places where we can go and eat for sure. And that was really good. I just think that the establishments treated us horribly, and constantly being run off from places. I've been in several occasions where the cops swept through and just destroyed everything that I had. And no, my tent, everything just swept through and wiped out. And so what really helped me was street outreach, downtown Olympia, getting food, hot food. And then I don't know if it was called, what it was called, but the street outreach that would come twice a week and give sleeping bags and dry clothes and batteries and flashlights and all the things. And then just the shelter itself was so much more than a bed. We'd have people meeting with us constantly and talking about our goals and like giving us hope. Like, this is where you are now, but this is where we're going to work towards you being. I would have never got into treatment if it wasn't for Rebecca and Meg and a lot of the staff. I would have never got into a Native American treatment center up there. They tried 3 different occasions to get me there, and I flaked it off. And then finally, I made it there. And that's when the beginning of my life, that's when it all started turning around. So I didn't know that.
We bribed you with a carton of cigarettes, didn't we, to get you there? Or like at least a few packs. We were like, what is it going to take? And we were like, we'll give you cigarettes, lots of cigarettes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, it's so interesting, like, yeah, going back to that time. I mean, just some like very practical things that are really different is that our shelter's 24/7 now, and that like we have a building that we designed. I like to joke about like we designed it based on all of the fights that people got in at the shelter about space, because it was hard, because we're in this like labyrinth of a basement of a church, and so like all the bed spaces were slightly different sizes. The partitions that we had were movable. So sometimes people with more stuff would move the partitions, and then the people with less stuff would have a smaller bed space. There were never any outlets anywhere for people. We didn't have showers. We didn't have laundry. So a lot of times, like the things that people would really rightfully so be like complaining about, we made a mental note about. And I would say often, I'd be like, someday you're going to see that I heard you. Like, and I can't tell you now, but and now it's like we literally like designed the whole shelter that we have now. It's like every bed space is the same size. The partitions are the same size. Everyone has their lockers and then their own outlet in their bed space with them, instead of having lockers down the hall where people didn't believe or trust that their stuff was going to be safe. So like a lot of those things are practically different now. We have a community kit. We didn't have a kitchen that people could use at the old shelter. We have that now. The dedicated outdoor space that we had was the parking lot. So now we have this beautiful patio that has, raised bed gardens in it, and people can be out there. The other thing is that, so Nobly, did you leave before the community care center was open, or had it just, I think you did.
Yeah, it was like approved, but like the groundbreaking and hadn't quite happened yet.
Yeah. So shortly after Nobly left, we did open a day center for the exact reason that she's talking about, that people didn't have anywhere to go. And that was a partnership with the hospital, which was always kind of contentious, because basically it was this hospital sign in the heart of downtown where people would drive from the east side to the west side or from the west side to the hospital. And there was sometimes 200 to 300 people a day that were utilizing that space. It was very well utilized. It was amazing. From a standpoint of like effective service delivery, it was amazing. And politically, the hospital, it wasn't, it was too well used, I guess I'll say. Too well utilized, too visible. And so there was always like a struggle there. And when the pandemic happened, they specifically said that they were using the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink the model. So they closed and that's that day that they closed. We said, well, at least we're going to go to 24-hour shelter for the people staying at the shelter because it's completely unacceptable that people should be outside during a pandemic. So that was when we basically, because the overnight only was also part of our permit from the city. So when the pandemic happened, we said emergency ordinance, like we are going 24/7. And they were like, yep, it's a pandemic, it's an emergency. And so now we'll never go back. So that's like a shift that happened there. And
So
then, oh,
sorry.
sorry.
So COVID helped to, I guess, make some real improvements
Yeah.
in a way, some of the, some real positive side effects of that.
Yeah, definitely. There were a lot of investments made in things that we have been fighting for decades. There was real investment made because of the fear of the spread of COVID. And so that was really kind of interesting to see that there was a lot more emphasis on outreach. There was a lot more emphasis on getting housing developed quickly. There was a lot more emphasis on getting people into non-congregant shelter options. And so that really has pushed things forward. The problem is that it was only temporary investment. Um, and so in terms of like long-term changes, one of them was that we were able to buy a building that we opened because the hospital closed the day center downtown. We bought a building which is Sergio's. And Sergio's is named after a late beloved person of both Nobly and I. And we're trying to basically recreate the community care center there. So that's like a physical asset that has stayed and was possible because of the pandemic. But yeah, so I mean, I think that the other thing I just want to say briefly too is that in 2018, the city of Olympia passed the Home Fund, and that was like a ballot initiative that we worked really hard to get passed. And it's a sales tax. It's a 0.1% sales tax that's permanent, and it is a dedicated funding source for homeless services and affordable housing development. So a lot. So and then in 2021, I believe, or maybe 2022, Beth Dolio from Olympia and Jess Bateman and some other folks worked really hard in the state legislature to pass that counties could pass a home fund by a councilmatic vote rather than a vote of the people. So meaning that the county council itself just needs a majority vote to pass a home fund. So our county did that. So now the Olympia Home Fund is combined with the Thurston County Home Fund. And so that resource just started getting collected on in the last year or so. So we haven't even really begun to see what is possible with that. So those things are like major differences from when Nobly was with us that are, in my opinion, we need even more of it. But
It
Right. So
is so good to hear that. I mean, I'm just sitting here like just glowing because of all the, I agree more needs to happen, but just what's happened since I've been there, it's just, I'm just so happy to hear that. It makes me so happy.
yeah, really awesome stuff. And great that there, it sounds like, there's some um public leaders, some elected leaders, some people in government who are have shared interest in, in fighting for those resources to be there, which is not the case everywhere.
yeah,
And uh, so I'm also I was going to come in with the bummer, like,
yeah,
and on that same theme, you more investments, more, improved services and resources, and still um not enough to meet the need. I'm curious if you've seen changes, or if you want to speak to the changes there. I mean, I think Nobly, you were going to ask.
Yeah, I was just gonna ask like how often people go from houseless to like stable housing.
yeah.
Because I think people are unaware of these trends, you know. Some people are, but a lot of people are just unaware of what that looks like.
Yeah. And it's kind of it sort of is a tricky question just because there are so many different factors, but like from from a practical standpoint, like again, this is just Thurston County data, but in the first quarter of 2024, there were 24% of people in emergency shelters that exited to permanent housing. There was 61% that exited to temporary housing. And then there was 15% that were either, unknown or back to the streets or whatever to other destinations. So the target goal for state of Washington, what we would like to be at is 50% of exits from emergency shelter would be going to permanent housing. Um, but the issue, like why I think, and this goes into sort of philosophically like a lot, but I think that there's this community perception that like nothing's being done because homelessness becomes like more and more visible. And I think that what people, and especially during the pandemic, it became a lot more visible. I had so many people say to me, like, oh my God, when the stay at home order happened, and then it was like, what happened to downtown? And I was like, oh, this is the downtown I've always seen. But this is what I've always seen when I've been down here, but you all left. Everybody else left. And now it's like people were seeing it with new eyes, like people in doorways and people with tents and so it just like became really like visible in this way. And so I think people got this perception that like nothing has happened and nothing's being done. And as we've already talked about today, like unbelievable progress has happened in our community alone. But the scale to which it is happening as compared to the scale of how many people are actually living in poverty in our community is uh not it's not to scale. So the investments that we are making are not keeping pace with the reality of our economic situation that we're in. So for example, in Thurston County alone, there are 30,000 rent burdened families. That means there are 30,000 families, households, who are paying more than 1/3 of their income to their rent or to their mortgage. Um, Now, many of those people, I like to talk about like we all have a safety net of some sort. some of them are just like this, like tight, and some of them are like, you know, this, right? And so like if I were to fall on an economic crisis, like I couldn't pay my rent or my mortgage, I would have a laundry list of maybe 3 or 4 people I could call for help. They could help for probably somewhere between 1 and 3 months, dependent. So you like do that out. It's like, okay, 5 people, you know, with 4 months each that they could help me. That's gonna buy me what, a year or two maybe of whatever. Then I can ideally get back on my feet or whatever. Some other people might have one person they could call. Other people might have no one they can call, right? And so it's like this is also why we're seeing more people in cars and RVs. Some people have cars and RVs, so before they hit an encampment, they are able to they lose their housing. Part of their safety net is their car or their RV. Um and so it's like what we are seeing is the reality of how many people are poor, living poor in our communities. And so the investments that we have to make have to be realistic. And we are nowhere near politically, we are nowhere near the political will to invest at the rate that we really need to. And then, of course, the housing stock is another big issue. State of Washington's about to put out a report about the like millions and millions and millions of units of housing behind the curve we are for all incomes, for wealthy people, for middle class people, and for poor and extremely poor people. So it's like we've come so, you know, what we say in recovery communities a lot, come so far to go.
It's interesting. Of course, you know, thinking about that safety net piece, that I was able to, you know, I always feel like um, people who are able to, you know, make the ends meet, you know, get through those difficult times, um, oftentimes seem to talk about as if, you know, there's some have done so completely on their own. And I would venture to guess that most folks are having some kind of help, like to the fact that to the point where they don't even really acknowledge it. It's like, oh, I'm having trouble meeting, you know, paying my bills here for a little bit, and my parents can help, or you know, somebody else can help with all of that. You know, I personally have had friends stay with me for several months at a time, or you know, just help to patch over and you know, help financially with friends. And then, as I wrote about, my husband's parents kept us from losing our housing completely, and which was you know, something of a freaking miracle, living in a place where rents were skyrocketing, that we had some of the most, you know, one of the most affordable places we could find, the lowest cost places we could find that we were living, and then rent was going to keep going up every year, and we were already on the edge of what we could afford. And then it just blew my mind that his parents came in and gave us a down payment on a house and basically lended us their credit history. And we bought a house, and went from then a teeny tiny little place for almost $1,200 down to $790 a month on our mortgage. And like this is, and a true asset that we had. I just
Yeah.
it blows my mind. Now I know like the housing market is different now, but the fact that um that if you have some access to support and privilege in your in safety net, and that just breeds more,
Yeah.
where the further away you are from that, the easier it is to fall, if there aren't, more hands catching you.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, definitely.
So, one of the big problems when I was staying tent camping was how often the police came and swept the camps. Like there was a camp close to the Walmart in Tumwater. Back in there, there was lots and lots of places, and then all of a sudden they just came through and swept all of that out. Nobody was allowed there anymore. I think it's like that way on Martin Way and some of the other places that I used to camp at a lot. Do you feel like they're doing more of that now, or have they kind of backed off on that? I'm just kind of curious what that's looking like.
It's got a new outfit on. So I think like on the one hand they're doing it it's just different. So there has been a lot more emphasis on providing resources to camps, particularly camps that are either on public property or that are state property, county property, or that are on private property that the government jurisdiction of that area where the private property is has a like relationship with the property owner. So like the jungle, for example, is private property. It's partially private property, partially city property. It used to be entirely private. But the city like works with the private property owner to say if we provide dumpsters and porta potties, can we like make it so that people don't have to leave, try to make it safer there? Because there's, at any given time, there's up to 150 people that live there. So like if the jungle closed, like what really would the city do, So they know that. So they work with the property owner. So in that way, like, back in the day, there was nothing, like back in your day, there was no talk about providing dumpsters or porta potties at encampments, right? A lot of that changed during the pandemic. So on that hand, that's great. There's more support for encampments in that way. But the new flavor of sweeping camps has been to sweep the camps, but only do it once people have been offered a viable spot somewhere. So whether that's a shelter bed with us, a tiny home, there's a bunch of tiny home villages now in Thurston County that weren't there before. There's one hotel that's operating as a shelter since this last year. And this is all a targeted investment from Department of Transportation and the governor's office. It's called the Right of Way Initiative. And it's to essentially close camps that are on the state right of ways. So most of that is on ramp, off ramp. So like Nickerson, Wheeler, there was this camp called the Hobby Lobby that was by the Hobby Lobby on Slater Kinney. And so there are these specific camps that they are closing, but they aren't going to do it until they've offered a spot to everybody. Now, does everybody qualify for that spot? Does everybody want that spot? Can everybody make it in that spot? It's like, what does it mean to offer someone housing and then they decline it? And so then it's like, well, we offered. And you're like, right, but are you offering them something that they can actually say yes to? So it's confusing because I don't think anyone believes that people should live in encampments like that. But when we don't have real actual autonomy over housing choice, then that's what we're left with. And so then we close it anyway. And of course, not everybody takes the options that they're given. Of course, not everybody succeeds in those options for a long-term period. And you might have seen recently on TikTok and social media, it came out that the Department of Transportation spent $700,000 on boulders, on big rocks at the Sleater Kinney camp to replace to because they harden the spot. So after they offer people the housing, people take it or they don't. They remove everybody and then they harden the spot. So they cut down the trees, they put rocks there. And so it's been interesting that that portion of it got picked up because until now it's all been like, yay, the camps are closing, and I will give it to the Right of Way Initiative that usually when camps are swept the way that Nobly is describing, there's like essentially a 0% rate of anyone getting housed. Like people just literally are whack-a-mole moved to another place. With the Right of Way Initiative, they've seen, I think, closer to like 50% of folks, or even higher in some cases. I could be misspeaking about that, but it's a significant percentage of the people are getting into a better circumstance. So that's interesting to me because I'm like, okay, so this is a targeted investment of a lot of money with strong political will. And we're, oh, shocking, seeing way better outcomes than with the status quo approach. So I think that there's like pros and cons to the Right of Way Initiative and a lot that we can learn from it. Um, but bottom line is that camps are still getting swept. It's just like got a different look.
That was just super devastating. And so, like you said, it's got a different outfit.
Yeah.
I bet it was devastating, Nobly. When you were talking about that earlier, I was, and then talking about, street outreach and giving out, supplies, sleeping bags and things. I was just in my head, I had this picture of your camp getting swept, all your belongings getting taken. I imagine some personal things that were emotional, and then those practical things that you would just need to like turn around and go get new ones from somewhere. And I just, it baffles me thinking about how not a great use of resources that is.
Yeah.
Yeah, not to mention and not to gloss over the emotional toll that I can imagine in your shoes.
Yeah, it's basically everything that you have. And like, especially for me, I had a partner at the time that just like loved to like destroy my stuff or take my stuff. And so, in a couple of instances, I've had to go above and beyond to find a spot that he didn't know about. You know what I mean? And I remember thinking, I finally found a spot and I could finally have these things and not have them taken from me. And then I was sleeping in there and OPD just like shook me down, was like, get up, get out. And then like I had to watch them tear up my camp. And that was just really brutal. Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about why a variety of these changes have happened. COVID contributing to greater investment and just some more stable resources coming in through the city and county home funds, um, and we haven't talked about what I think. Well, maybe a little bit touched on the generally increasing numbers around the country of people who are unhoused in specific places as well. I'm curious, is that true as well? Are there, you were saying, looks the same to me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, so it's true and not true. It's interesting. So during the pandemic, particularly the second year of the pandemic, was one of the first times that we've seen on a nationwide level the number of homeless people decline in a while. So we saw actually the numbers were declining, 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 declining. And then 2008 happened. Who remembers what happened in 2008? Housing crisis, where all the banks, the mortgage crisis and all the things and the banks, and then everybody was sort of like, oh no, this is going to devastate anything. And then it stayed kind of steady for 2008, 2009. And then 2010, boom, we saw the numbers. And again, that for me is that safety net theory, right? Where it takes a little while from an economic tragedy for most people to fall into being street homeless, or car homeless. And so, but 2010, the numbers went way higher, and then it stayed pretty steady, started to decline, pandemic, and then kind of popped back up again 2000, like 14, 15-ish, around there. And then when the pandemic happened, again, that was like the first time that we saw the number decline. And I think that a lot of people talk about that being attributed to the investment that was made in housing people, and also because of um, the massive amount of rent assistance that went out during COVID. So people who would have fallen into homelessness didn't, because of the massive amount of rent assistance that went out. And so those are the trends that made it so that it went down. But then we see that money run out, the rent assistance stops, and now we're anticipating to see the numbers increase again. So it's not just like this, like it's just getting worse and worse and worse and going up and up and up and up and up, right? It's like this thing that is very tied directly to what's happening with housing, what's happening with rents, what's happening with vacancies. So a really low vacancy rate and very high rents, you're going to see higher numbers of folks experiencing homelessness. That's typically all up and down the West Coast, low vacancy, high rents. It's Denver. It's, if you think about all the places that have the most visible homelessness and you do a tiny bit of digging into their housing market, you're going to see that there are low vacancies, high rents. And so that is like, I do anticipate it going up more, but I think that what really changed was that the rest of the world stopped. And so people saw it with new eyes. And so now you can't unsee it. I often talk about working with folks on the street as like similarly to, I don't know if either of you have ever gone like morel mushroom hunting, but morel mushrooms, they grow in burn areas. And so it's really interesting because you're going through this burn area where everything is like charred and burned. And you're like, okay, we're in this like whatever. And then you see one mushroom. And then you're like, oh, there's one. And then you notice that you've been like standing in a whole field of mushrooms, but you couldn't see it, right? Until you saw like the one. And I think it's a very similar phenomenon with this. And so now communities can't unsee it, right? Which I believe ultimately is a good thing. But it makes it hard to have the discussion of who's like how many people are actually homeless, what is actually going on, because people's perception of it is very much based on their own view and their own, what they're seeing or not seeing.
Let's kind of shift a little bit. Thank you so much by the way, for all of the, detailed, I think really drawing out the picture of what's happening there and why. But let's shift and like talk a little bit about what's working and not and recommendations. Um, Nobly, do you want to start that?
You want me to talk about?
No, just the starting that series of questions.
Sorry, I'm kind of, I might be ill prepared on that one.
No, it's okay.
If you start it, then I will be able to pick up on it. Sorry.
No worries. I guess let's just start with the positives. I mean, we have heard a lot of positives about what has been going well. Are there specific things that you can pinpoint, other than something beyond our control, like a massive pandemic,
Mhm.
right? That has really been a useful lever, like what's really working or helping in the area. And I guess when you answer that, if you might also clarify, the question is what's working in your area, but what does that really mean to
Yeah.
be working? Yeah, because I think that
Yeah.
varies based on your perspective.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what's working is investment in housing development for people who are in the what's considered to be extremely low, very low and extremely low income. So that's defined as people who make less than 50% of the area media income. So it varies from community to community, and that's 0 to 50 and then 0 to 30. So zero income to 30% and zero income to 50%. So investment in building that housing um, has been very important. The mechanism that typically goes through is the Washington State Housing Finance Commission, the State Department of Commerce, and then it's affordable subsidized housing is built through federally through this tax. It's called the tax credit, the low income tax credit program. So that's like the mechanism for how long-term subsidized housing is built. Um, we've made bigger investments in that, particularly in Washington State, in the last few or the last couple of rounds of the state legislature, and I hope that remains. But again, like in Thurston County, for example, it's really only come out to about 65 units of housing development per year for that group of people. Um, 2 years ago, it was Unity Commons where the shelter is built. So the shelter's on the bottom floor, and then there's 65 apartments above it. Um, this last year, it was 65 apartments that for families and with dependent children that the Family Support Center built. Next year, it's going to be the Unity Commons phase 2, which is another 64 apartments. So it's like, that's amazing. That's great. That's like the people that got housed in Unity Commons apartments phase 1 were all people who had been in shelter for anywhere between 1 and like 9 years because there had been no options for where they could move. And it's literally like until you build it, they're not going to move. They don't have any options of where to go. And so um those are extremely impactful, working so well as a strategy to resolve homelessness. 2, 3 years later, over 90% of the people who got housed there still live there. The people who don't still live there, 4 of them have passed away. That's usually the reason why. And so it's like, it's working extremely well. But again, 65 units in a community like Thurston County you're never going to get ahead of the ball.
Back to your the comment you made about investments and the level of investment that is just needed. It's just
Yeah.
out of sync. Yeah. Okay.
And it's the capacity of the community too, because like what was one thing that happened with a lot of the COVID money was that suddenly communities were flooded because we've all had to adapt to being underfunded, under-resourced, overutilized. And so then to suddenly have a huge influx of resources, some communities struggled to spend all of the money that they got because the infrastructure isn't set up to thrive. So it's a combination there of both the actual resources, but then building the infrastructure for communities to be able to scale up. But we're never going to be able to do that if we are still fighting about who deserves to get housed and who doesn't, which is really, when I think about like, how do we imagine a country without homelessness in the United States? Like, there's those practicalities, the resources and the building and the like all that, but it's like the truth is that we as a society view housing as a commodity, as a retirement plan, as a smart investment. We don't view housing as necessary to the survival of human beings. And I don't believe that we're ever going to see the end of homelessness until we make that fundamental shift. And we can't make that fundamental shift until we believe that it's fundamental to the survival of every human being, regardless of which human being it is. So we would have to do away with they're choosing this life. We would have to do away with they're not from here. We would have to do away with they need to earn it. And that's a very, very big shift.
Then it's an enormous shift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think that like there are examples of what's working that we need to keep investing more and more and more in. That's the main one. The other one I think is peer support services, people with lived experience, who've been there, who've walked it, who've talked it, being able to support other people. I think that industry, if you want to call it that movement, let's say, needs to be better cared for. A lot of times peers get put on the front lines of really intense stuff, and they're often paid way less than social workers or therapists, and they don't have the network of support for mental health services. So there's people who are in recovery fall out of recovery because of peer jobs. So there needs to be more support there, but that's working really well.
I just wanted to mention something really quick. For me personally, I didn't even hear about this when I lived, when I was houseless in Olympia, but another good stepping stone when you're ready to do it is the Oxford, like the recovery houses, because of the fact it's like $400 a month for a room, and you can do that because you're not going to be able to, go and rent a place for $1,400 a month somewhere. But you don't have to have like an ID to live there. You don't have to have, you know what I mean? There's a lot of things that you don't have to have. And for me personally, that was my saving grace, but I didn't know anything about that. You know what I mean? So it doesn't cure homelessness by any means, but it's a good stepping stone in the middle between being houseless, going to treatment, being ready to make some certain changes, and then actually being able to afford that kind of rent,
Yeah.
which most Americans right now can't
Yeah.
afford that kind of rent. So just for me, that personally, that was huge.
Yeah. That's the other thing that is working, but is not really embedded in communities very much is universal income. So um when I think about like the end to homelessness, it's that we have adequate to the scale that we need number of affordable housing units. We have free and broad ranging access to healthcare, and we have a universal basic income. Um, it's literally just getting money, healthcare, and housing into the hands of as many people as we possibly can. So that is working. There are lots of reports to show how effective that is. But it's not embedded in our community and it's not embedded in many yet. But I think that that's a really exciting prospect.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of that too. And I was actually recently sitting at an airport talking with somebody about both universal basic income and um, everybody being provided with basic housing. And but I wasn't talking about it in terms of addressing um, homelessness. I was talking about it because of the changes we see on the horizon in work and automation of work, and fewer good paying jobs that could be accessed by anyone regardless of level of education. And I'm like, so I was talking about it in terms of just like, in many ways, if you think about COVID and all the investment that went in there, was a general, it was a basically a society-wide need.
Yeah.
And so that response happened, and I see another society-wide need coming with the automation of work. And we would it it would behoove us to get on that more and more now to get ahead of that major crisis coming in. My little
No, I
spin.
mean, I completely agree with you, and that's how a lot of other countries do it. In Europe, predominantly, where everybody gets a housing subsidy based on the income that you have or whatever. And um, but again, that means that we have to have the political will to give somebody like when Nobley was going hard cash, right? And it's like, could that have been a thing that like could Nobley have maybe gotten housing at that time and done that? Like, I believe in you. I believe that you could have. I believe you could have with the right help and with the right support, right? But like how do we extend that to people who are active drug users, who are living, with serious mental illnesses? Like, so again, there's that huge shift. But I think and like also the thing that Americans hate to be proactive. We always have to wait for the crisis. But I completely agree with you. And I hope that more people see what the pandemic was and that we don't just forget.
Right. Well, and and I hope that these demonstration projects that are happening with the basic income
Yeah.
demonstration projects, um, the reporting and research. I know there's a lot of research going on in all of those projects, and I just had a quick glimpse at Denver's first year, and showing reduction in spending on drugs and alcohol and
Yeah.
cigarettes. And I think about that for my own addiction, and including smoking. I was a big old smoker for a lot of years. and it felt like, you know, in many cases, like that thing that was going to get me through my day when I had no other options. But
Yeah.
when options opened up, those considerations changed. And
Yeah.
I think that that's why they're seeing in these basic income projects, that that is going down for people, because you actually go, oh, there there are, well, options. I said options are like oxygen. You know, they
Yeah.
absolutely are. And it changes the fundamental way we orient to life.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. Anyways, more soapboxes, but
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny. It's just like the myth busting always, where it's like, oh, homeless people are lazy. And it's like, there are no harder workers than people who are experiencing homelessness. And there's no better budgeters. People can stretch a dollar like you wouldn't believe, right? And it's like, that's why it's just so funny of like people misspend their money or misuse their money and it's like, no, I don't know,
yeah.
and it's interesting too, like that all of the solutions that I talked about today, at least in our area, they're funded through sales tax.
Mm.
So I often hear a lot about how, well, when are they going to contribute to the, whatever. And sales tax initiatives are a fixed percentage, regardless of what your income is. Income taxes are based on your income. Sales taxes are not. Everybody pays 10% in our area, roughly, just under 10%. So if you make $1,000 in a month, you're paying 10% for the things that you buy. If you make $10,000 in a month, you're paying 10% of the things that you buy. And so the poor person pays about 16% higher of their percentage of their income to sales tax than a wealthy person. And so it's also like, it's just like changing, you know, the view that the stigma that people are up against. And I think we've come a really long way in that, but it's very entrenched.
So I'm noticing the time and some other really big questions that
Yeah.
we had hoped
Yeah.
we would touch base on. Do you have a little longer?
Yeah. I could do a few more minutes.
Okay. So we have Nobly, is it okay if I just kind of mess with these end questions here?
Yeah.
Kind of mush them together. So um I guess I want to ask you to think about kinds of things that a community, um all of our communities could do um to really make that fundamental difference. I mean, we've talked to like those really big, you know, some people would call pie in the sky, but I don't think they are. But you know, that's mostly you're going to find from community to community, not the will. But for and maybe your answer is still the same, it still lands there. But just thinking about that, where we're really thinking about transforming the situation. Um, what do you think communities um, get wrong and or kind of um, need to understand better um, in order to really make that difference?
Well, I think fundamentally my answer stays the same that, it's access to ample and affordable, like truly affordable housing for people who are on zero to fixed income, like zero to disability income, basically. I think it's access to um, affordable and robust health care that includes preventative health, primary care, all of that. And it's increasing incomes somehow. Um, but from those three like big places, there's thousands of entry points. And I think that, you know, what it would be is figuring out what entry point is the entry point that's best for you. And that could range from electing people into local offices that could advocate for creating funding sources for one of those three prongs, right? So that's maybe you yourself running. That's maybe you helping on a campaign or recruiting somebody who could run to do that. A lot of change can happen at local levels that make real daily impacts in people's lives. It's doing some research about, most communities have a community block grant. A percentage of that can go to social services. What influence can you have on how that money is spent? What education can you do to find out what money is or isn't being spent on these issues? I think the one thing that communities often get wrong that I believe that Olympia has gotten right at certain points in time is actually listening to the people who are in that experience as to what they say that they need. And then what access points do you have to get that information into the hands of decision makers and into the hands of resource folks? Decision makers might not always be city council people. Like we said at the very beginning of this, it might be people running organizations currently who have rules at their organizations that are keeping people out and helping them to understand why they should rethink that model, right? It's like, it's tough because I feel like there's just thousands of ideas of how to get involved. And I guess what I want to leave people with is that I didn't come to this work saying, I'm going to start a shelter. I came to this work saying, I want to give out blankets on the street because I figure people probably need blankets. And then I like met people and I learned more and I heard more and I listened to what they were saying and I figured, what skills do I have? What influence could I have? I thought that going to city council would be a pointless endeavor. No one would ever listen to somebody like me, right? I went anyway, fumbled through my first thing, realized there was another meeting again the next week, thought, okay, I guess I'll show up again, right? It's like really just showing up for your community, for yourself, and then figuring out what skills you have to be able to make changes that are the right fit for your community. And I always say this, it's like doing your part to chip away slowly at the notion that some people deserve housing and other people don't. And I heard this amazing poet describing like large scale change, like the housing crisis or healthcare or whatever, where it feels so overwhelming, but it's like thinking about it like waves. And that eventually, like the waves, some people can step up really strong and other people have to take a step back at times. Right. But if enough of us are moving with the thing, the waves eventually like break the wall down. And so it's like you might not be somebody who can start a shelter. That might not be your skill set. That might not be your passion. That might not be, you might not be the one to do that, but you might be the one to be able to, like my partner, cook dinner every single night for the person that's doing that, right? And keeping them healthy and sane and whatever. Like that might be your contribution to the movement, right? Um, because we believe that there's just always an intervention that's possible. Like whether it's people we're working with, like we could have given up on Nobly so many times, right? And on so many people like Nobly so many times. Like some of the people you mentioned at the beginning of this call that are still your folks, can you believe they're alive? Can you believe that it's a freaking miracle? But it's also not a miracle. It's like also that they just didn't get given up on.
And what a loss. I'm sorry, what a loss it would have been. What a loss it would be to me if you all had given up on Nobly. What a loss to all the people you're serving Nobly. If I, I just, I mean, yeah, thank you for
What always comes to my mind really quick is Dee Dee. I mean, everybody in Olympia was done with Dee Dee.
Yep.
Except for Interfaith Works, and she ended up getting housed, and it's just a beautiful story.
Yeah.
And that's what always comes to my mind. But nobody ever did give up on me there, and it was like another thing that people can do is like glimpses of hope.
Yeah.
Maybe all you can do, I try not to bawl, but maybe all you can do is look that homeless person in the eye. You don't even have to give them $1. Just look at them.
Yeah.
Maybe just treat them like a human being. Maybe let them sit in your establishment for 30 minutes. Like you don't know what little random act of kindness for no other reason than that's what you want to do is pay it forward will have an impact on the person. Like people are estranged from their families for years. They don't even have families. Nobody calls them and nobody worries about their birthday. Like the other day, for instance, I was driving past, this homeless person that had his dog and he was flying a sign or whatever. And I kind of drove by him at first because I was in a hurry and I got to the stop sign and I'm like, no. So I turned back around and I gave him $10 and this man just starts like weeping, like just out of control weeping. And I'm like, what's going on? And he's like, you don't understand. Nobody has told me happy birthday in like 12 years. Like nobody has ever, and it's my birthday. And it was just like this whole thing. And it's like, not only did I drive away feeling like, wow, that made a difference, but he probably lived on that experience for who knows how long.
Yeah.
So that's kind of my thing. And it's usually the people with lived experience that are out there that are just trying to do that in the smallest amount of, if that's all you can do, that's beautiful, because it's gonna take everybody, like you said, everybody's contribution, no matter how large or small, to try to get a handle on this, so.
Yeah.
gonna ask kind of along those lines, because I'm thinking about some real cruelty out there. Some of the attitudes we've mentioned in here just feel really cruel and inhumane. And I'm thinking, what would you say to somebody who might be listening now and struggling, or maybe not listening here, maybe not able to listen, but maybe struggling now, and might be having a lot of doors slammed and ugly things said to them and about them in earshot. Um, who would you say?
Mhm. I mean, I would say that that anyone in your situation would be doing exactly what you're doing. Like, you're not wrong, you're not bad, you're not lazy, none of those things. Like, you just, for everything that you've gone through, it's like a miracle that you're here right now. And like,
Yeah.
that's what the world needs, is for you to be here. I don't know. Sorry, Nobly, if you want to add to that.
No, that's pretty much what I was gonna say, that like you do matter, that you are wanted here, and that the world is, a better place with you in it, no matter what, you've been made to feel. And also, like, some of the people that I met living on the streets with them were the most talented. We're talking singers, songwriters, artists, poets. We're talking from playing spoons on a bucket to like painting the most murals on the side of the streets of Olympia, like the free graffiti wall, just boom. Like, I would say go after it, do it, because it's we need it.
And I think that the judgment that you're feeling is really people projecting their own fears. You are like the scapegoat of their own fears. And so, like, that's not fair. That's not right. That's not okay. But it's not actually a reflection of you at all. It's their own fear, discomfort, sadness, anger, all of those things getting put on you. And it's not yours to have to carry. Like, you know,
And I would just add that in addition to um, that, outside of those people, there are a whole lot of people that know that
yes.
you're there and here that care, and willing to listen, be with you, help you however. Yeah. So one last question, which I don't know if you've actually already answered it, but related to homelessness or completely off topic. What's one big wish you have that, if fulfilled, you believe would make this a better world?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just that, like, fundamental belief that every life is worth it.
Love it.
Yeah, every life is like worth the effort to try and see, to validate, to love, to, yeah, that doesn't need to be earned.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all so much.
Nobly, you want to take us in?
Yes, so I want to thank you so much, Meg. This just meant a lot for me to be here, and I just want to thank you for never giving up on me and for keeping me safe and just doing all the things that you did for me personally and that you do for people every day. You will forever be my person, and I would not be here where I am without your help and the way that you treated me. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. And we have a really quick announcement, and then I would like you to join us in our two favorite medicines, which we do, which is water and laughter.
Great.
So the quick announcement is our February conversation will be another story episode, this time with a young woman named Tuesday. She'll share her personal survival story and the challenges and bright spots she faced along the way, including what's hopeful for her now. So we look forward to supporting her and, of course, learning from her experience. And I just wanted to note what's, so important about these story episodes is, everybody who comes on to share their story in such a deep and vulnerable way offer such an important service to our communities, because for many of us, it helps us to feel less alone in our own struggles. And I think it also offers some important clues on how our support systems, both public and private, can do better and reduce unnecessary suffering in this world. So we hope folks will join us in giving her support in return. So with that, a little laughter, nobly.
Okay, so I really, this is my dad joke goes way back, but how come God only invented one Yogi Bear?
One Yogi.
You
I mean,
know.
there should be 1,000, so I don't know.
Because the other one was a boo-boo. So dumb. The other one I found out that I was gonna do was a tiny bit inappropriate. So, I think I'll have to staff that one with you, Megan.
Oh, it's beautiful. So
Water,
water,
cheers.
tears.
Everybody.
Yeah.